Okay, I have got here Barbara Stinnett, who is my sister in law, and her husband Larry is sitting next to her listening, and her dog BG is out on the porch with her. And if a young lady pops her head in, that would be my niece Natalie. And Carlista is a member of our church and a dear friend. And Brenda is my soul sister. I talk about her in this presentation. So,
Oh my, can you hear me, Sharon?
yes, I can hear you.
Wonderful, thank you. Hi, Barbara. Hi, Carlista. It's nice to meet
Hello.
you.
Hi, Brenda, and hi, Clarista. Glad to
All
meet
right.
you too.
So, here we go. This presentation starts with a warning. Thus, that little sign. For those of you who live in the Kingsport metro area like I do, uh, we are almost guaranteed that we won't encounter people of other races unless we do it intentionally. And this means we don't know about their experiences. We live in that big blue bubble, and we don't have any idea of what life is like in the orange, yellow, and other hues of blue slices. It is my privilege to have a sister of my soul who is African American. You have met her, Brenda. She has listened to me as I have read, studied, and explored in as many ways as I can the experience of African Americans in this country. She did not need to do that to be my friend. She did not need to share her stories with me. I am blessed that she has, for she has corroborated everything I've learned in my study. None of what I've seen is exaggerated. In fact, it's probably understated. I am by no means an expert. My only credential is that I'm a white person willing to talk with other white people about racism in America. And I will tell you, I am biased by what I've studied. I believe racism is real, it's pervasive, and it's deadly. I believe it is, as such faults always are, as dangerous to the people who hold it as it is to their targets. I believe we need to know we have it, we need to own it, and we need to repent of it. And although this doesn't appear anywhere else in the presentation, I'll say it here. I believe we need to begin a process to pay reparations. If you're still willing to listen, let's go on. Here are my sources, which I think are generally accepted. At least they were when I was in school. There are scholarly texts. There's quite a bit of information from the American Bar Association. I used the Encyclopedia Britannica to explain some terms. I consulted the original authors of critical race theory and other original authors of some things that I was studying. And uh, I have some information from those who have been directly affected. I was taught to seek and believe the lived experiences of people who were directly affected by history. For example, the Holocaust. So we're going to start with critical race theory because it has dominated so much of the news lately. It's important for us to know what it is and what it is not. I have read the book that tells the story of critical race theory by the people who developed it back in the 70s at Harvard Law School. And I can tell you that what little I am extracting from it is true to the spirit of the book. And by the way, if you have questions, go ahead and ask them while we're going along. There will be time at the end too if you want to do that. The fact that it was developed at Harvard Law School is critical to understanding it. Only lawyers will understand all of what it says because the whole theory was created by lawyers to address areas of law. Other disciplines such as philosophy and education saw value in it and adopted or adapted some of its thoughts, but it was and is primarily aimed at how the structure of law can be changed to include some issues about race that had been ignored while that structure was being built. For example, consider a black woman experiencing discrimination in the workplace. As these lawyers examined a real case like this, they saw a glaring flaw. Her boss demonstrated that he was not discriminating against blacks by showing his camaraderie with black men. He showed he did not discriminate against women because his secretary was a woman. The judge had no choice but to find for the defendant because there was no precedent for the intersection of black and woman. So, with that as an example of how the law in our country was built by rich white men to benefit rich white men, and that story is another whole presentation I could give. We'll go on. So, what it is, by one of the original developers of it, Crenshaw explains why each of those three words were chosen. She said they wanted to signify the specific political and intellectual location of the project through the word critical, the substantive focus of it through race, and the desire to develop a coherent account of race and law through the term theory. So now let's see what the dictionary says about those. Critical is expressing or involving an analysis of the merits and faults of a work of literature, music, art. Race are groups that humans are divided into based on physical traits common among people of shared ancestry. And theory is a supposition or a system of ideas intended to explain something, especially one based on general principles independent of the thing to be explained. So, the dictionary definition, I believe, fits their definition of the way they are using the words. And now there's a little graphic I'm going to show you to explain how it all came about. Critical theory, at the top box, was developed within the sociological and philosophical fields. Then the legal world had an area where they studied critical legal theory. Critical race theory drew from both of those established disciplines to create their ideas about how African Americans encounter the legal system. Offshoots like Native Americans and Asian Americans are working on incorporating their unique experiences into the U.S. legal code. So, out of 8 chapters in the book, I've chosen 3 to highlight today. First, we'll look at the last chapter, chapter 8, the end, about likely responses to the critical race theory movement. Then we'll look at chapter 1b at its tenets or its principles. And then we'll look at chapter 7, critical race theory today. I think these will give you a fairly good idea of what it is. But before we go there, let's look at what it is not. It is not elementary or secondary school material. It was designed for law schools specifically and is now taught in other graduate disciplines. It is not recent. It evolved from legal realism scholars of the late 19th and early 20th century jurists. It was expanded in the 1970s. That's the work that the people who wrote the book did. It was organized in 1989 by those people and others. And it was unified in 2020 with the publication of the book. It is not partisan. It seeks to inform about how our legal index was developed unconsciously for white men who were property owners. Others' rights have had to be added to the index in a deliberate manner. For example, women had to get the right to vote by a change in the law in 1920. It was not originally part of the law for women to be able to vote, as we all well know. So, other people's rights besides white men who were property owners have had to be added deliberately. One quote says, "They are calling anything having to do with race critical race theory," and that's just incorrect. Critical race theory is a very specific thing that, like what we've already said. Teachers have been suspended in violation of recent laws against critical race theory when they have simply mentioned systemic racism or Black Lives Matter. There was a social studies teacher at Central High School here in Sullivan County that was suspended for mentioning systemic racism. Let's continue with what it is not from the chapter where they address this. Some of what I'm showing here comes from that, but other topics I'm going to show come from the news. Okay. It is not Marxism. It is related to Marxism in one way. The political, social, and economic doctrine of Karl Marx, in particular, the view that capitalism exploits workers and promotes inequality, is part of the critical race theory foundation. So it is related, but it is not foundational because it agrees that capitalism encourages exploitation, but it advocates a reform of the capitalist economic system, not the destruction of it. It is not divisive. An analogy. People say it's divisive to talk about race, and that's like saying it's unhealthy to talk about diabetes. So just talking about it, the facts, the reality is not divisive. In fact, critical race theory proposes to remove the stigma of individual actions as being the primary driver of racism. And that will lead us to discuss systemic racism in a few minutes. It is not reinventing American history. It is reframing American history. So think of a picture where the frame has excluded large parts. Enlarging the frame to include the portions that have been omitted is not changing the picture, although it may change the way a viewer interprets the small part they've always seen in a certain way. To ignore the fact that slaveholding founders of our country didn't really mean that all men are created equal when they wrote it is disingenuous. It does not promote discrimination. Critics say that it does that by focusing on equality of results instead of equality of opportunity. So they say, you give everybody the same opportunity, and if they don't get the same results, well, that's not our fault. So, what does that mean? Here's a picture. Equality is to watch all of these children trying to watch a ball game over a fence. And so equality gives all of the boys the same size box to stand on. In the second image, individuals are given different supports to make it possible for them to have equal access to the game, and they are being treated equitably. In the third picture, they can all watch the game because the barriers have been removed. So I like that picture. Another thing it is not. It does not say that babies are racist. Here's all it says about babies and race. And I'm going to use a quote. At 3 months, babies prefer to look at faces of their own race. That's all the book says about it. In a flyer advertising the book, it says they're not too young to talk about race if they are able to recognize race at 3 months. Well, the critics say that young children shouldn't be exposed to racial differences. What they mean is they don't want white children to learn about racial differences. To show that, first, number one, they already do know there's a difference. At 3 months, they recognize the difference. And number two, children who are not white do not have a choice about learning about racism. They experience it every day. It does not say that all white people are racist. It does say that all white people benefit, usually unknowingly, from systemic racism. However, it seeks to take away the power of individual actions as the primary contributor to racism. Instead, it focuses on the issues that our systems exacerbate. It does not teach white children to feel guilty about their race. It seeks to tell the truth about America. It is not their goal or their intent to induce guilt in anyone. All they want to do, bring awareness to the situation, especially within the legal profession. Now, someone, even a child, may feel guilty as a result, but that depends on their individual temperament. It does not use storytelling to manipulate audiences. The opponents know that storytelling is effective, so they lob this charge at them that you're trying to manipulate audiences. Well, most of the critics use it themselves in one way or another. Even the lawyer critics use storytelling in the courtroom, and the stories that are told through critical race theory and other kinds of awareness efforts are not one in a million, as they claim. Indeed, they are representative of millions of people, and we'll see a little bit more of that as the presentation goes along. Some of the critics say, well, they criticize the quote in the book that says, "Objective truth like merit does not exist." But they don't finish the quote. They just leave it there. The finished quote, objective truth like merit does not exist in social science and politics. That changes the whole flavor. And here's a quote that's not in the book, it's from someone else, but it's from someone else that I think sums things up pretty well about what it is not. What happens when someone falsely proclaims what you think and then criticizes that proclamation? Is she really critiquing your ideas or her own? If a writer decides what both sides of an argument are stating, is he really engaging in an argument with himself? So, any questions about what it is not?
No.
Okay, to the last chapter, where they predicted how the theory might be received in America. We don't yet know how it may end, but you tell me, which of these attitudes are prevailing right now in our society? In my opinion, it is being marginalized and ignored. And why do I say that? Well, we'll move on through, we'll see what it is, and you can decide for yourself why critics are not at least partially incorporating it or even analyzing it before rejecting it. Why they are attempting to marginalize it so that the public will ignore it. Here are the main positions stated in the book. Racism is the common everyday experience of most people of color in this country. That's the first premise of the book. What do you think? Is that true or false? Well, let me ask you this. Can a man truthfully say what is the common everyday experience of a woman?
No.
No. So, can someone who is white credibly say what is the common everyday experience of people of color? I don't think so. This
No.
fact is not acknowledged by people who are not experiencing the racism. In fact, most people who do not experience racism, white people, say sometimes, some of them say, that they know the effects of racism better than those who do experience it. That just doesn't make sense. All right, the next point in the book is that our history and the systems that developed within it serves important purposes, both psychic and material, for the dominant group. This is a controversial statement to say that our systems serve important purposes for the dominant group. Well, think about it this way. Of course, the systems support the dominant group. All systems do. Think of a word processing system. Is it designed with the needs of an architect in mind? No. All systems support the dominant group. Next point, races are in no way biological. They are categories that society invents, manipulates, or retires when convenient. Well, I'll tell you what. Thank God that after World War II, Germany retired the idea of a master race to which all others were inferior. So to me, that proves the point that they're not biological, they are invented by society. And the last point in the book is that interest convergence, improvements in society's treatment of minorities, is integrally linked to some benefit for the dominant group. Another controversial statement. The dominant group does not want to see itself as helping minorities only if it benefits them. Well, I would say, how else are changes ever made? The dominant group has to experience some kind of benefit or they're not going to change anything. Christ, who introduced the most countercultural idea in the history of the world, said to love others as yourselves and went on to promise that making this change would lead to abundant life for the dominant group, the people who were most likely to reject his teaching. Christ knows human nature better than any other being in the universe. And Christ knew that the people who were likely to reject it had to see some benefit in it for themselves to accept his radical teaching. So that's it. Everything else in the book explores or supports or explains these four basic points and how the law can and should be changed as a result of these truths. So, the last part that we'll talk about on critical race theory is critical race theory today. Now, here are the systems that critical race theory seeks to shine a light on, to show that there are problems within these systems. The first is class. Rich people versus poor people, basically. And, you know, their point is that more people of color, of any color, live in poverty in terms of percentages of their population. Crime. They say in their book that many lethal acts, such as selling defective automobiles, alcohol and pharmaceuticals, or waging undeclared wars, take many more lives than crime does, and they are not considered crimes at all. I also saw that quote in on a website of university, of a law school of a university. All right, hate. Everyday acts of denigration and humiliation that go entirely unchallenged by other white people. Education. Just a couple of examples. Standardized testing is flawed, and affirmative action policies are in danger. And that could be a whole nother presentation in itself as well about why affirmative action is still needed. Globalization. In the book, they talk about joining forces with other marginalized people all over the world in order to institute change. They talk about voting rights that are under threat in many places. So now let's move on from critical race theory to systemic racism. I started building this little chart 2 years ago. We're not going to examine it in detail. I'm just showing it to you so you can see the many branches and sub-branches of racism in this country. And I'm sure I've not discovered all of them. There are so many entanglements and so many overlapping areas of where these kinds of things play into the lives of people of color. So, systemic racism, we're going to look at how it evolved through 3 different time periods, and we'll see how the country's entire span of history is still affecting lives today. The size of the eras, slavery, black codes, and civil rights era, are different because they are scaled to reflect the amount of time they prevailed as the way of life in America. Did you realize that in 2022, the system of slavery was part of our reality for 59% of our history? Think about that as we move along. So how did it develop, the systemic racism part, during the time of slavery? Well, one seemingly unrelated action at a time. I'm not going to read all of these, but these things happened, and one did not necessarily have anything to do with another, but they all affected the lives of slaves. And this is by no means an exhaustive list in the legal field or elsewhere that happened during slavery, but it is an example of how the law was codified as a system that ignored the fact that the people who were not writing the laws were excluded from its protections. Now, of course, we could say a whole lot more about slavery, given that it was prevalent during most of our history. However, let's move on to the Black Codes era. We're going to examine only 3 of the systems, and I've only got 2 of them listed here, but I'll mention the other one, that were pervasive between 1872 and 1969. The first is sharecropping, the second is convict labor, and the third is basically redlining and the GI Bill. Okay, so here's the thing. 82% of U.S. history, our black citizens have lived under oppression. You count slavery and black codes, 82% of the time they've lived under oppression. They've lived under laws, regulations, and societal norms that were designed to keep them in their place. Think of what a white man with property in any era of that 82% has passed on to his descendants versus what a black man from the same era has been able to pass on to his. Think of how many black men were illegally conscripted to contract labor or lynched, meaning they were not able to pass down anything. And black women, who were even less able to accumulate wealth, were the breadwinners. So if you're not familiar with contract labor, it's in 1872, the Southern whites instituted a different form of slavery, where they said that they took the clause in the 13th Amendment that says, except as punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, they would arrest black men on a whim and conscript them to convict labor, sometimes for life, much like slavery. So, let's go on. We're going to talk about sharecropping a little bit here. What happened was the sharecropper gets use of a land, and the landlord gives them seed. In exchange, the sharecropper promises the landowner half of the crop. The sharecropper buys food and clothing on credit from the landowner's store. The sharecropper plants and harvests the crop. The sharecropper gives the landowner the crop to sell. The sharecropper gets half the earnings minus his debt for the year. And when settling up, the landowner says that the sharecropper owes more than he has earned. You can say this because in the early days of sharecropping, the sharecroppers couldn't read. And then to pay the debt, the sharecropper promises the landowner a greater share of next year's crop. So how many families suffered because they were caught in some version of the company store economy? If you remember Tennessee Ernie Ford's song, "Another day older and deeper in debt. I can't go because I owe my soul to the company store." Now this affected a greater number of white people, but a greater percentage of blacks. And when white people were able to claw their way out of that poverty, they did not have to deal with the other systems of racism that were prevalent. Here's an example of a sharecropping contract, and I've just highlighted the parts where the landowner has constructed it to benefit himself. And the rest of it could also be interpreted that way, but especially the highlighted parts. This is in 1882, not long after the Civil War. Most of the adults still couldn't read. They had to take the landowner's word for it that what he was telling them was true. So again, think of the wealth that the white landlord passed on to his descendants and what the sharecropper passed on to his. Can you see how white descendants now are enjoying some measure of wealth that was gained at the expense of and by the labor of the sharecroppers, even today? So, redlining I mentioned. I got this part from Britannica Encyclopedia. And it says it's abusive, deceptive. It has penalties for prepaying loans. It was started by federal programs in 1933, 38. Neighborhoods that were mixed race or predominantly African American did not benefit from the federal programs such as the Homeowners Loan Corporation and the Federal Housing Administration, because their credit was considered high risk, just because they were black or mixed race, not because of anything having to do with their credit history. So, how important is homeownership to wealth creation? You've been taking my word for it up till now. I got this from the Housing and Urban Development arm of the government. And you can't read this very well, but it talks about income disparities and so forth. And it concluded, taken together, in our view, Table 8 and the other reported results present a strong argument that owned housing is an important means of wealth accumulation, and housing as wealth is particularly important for minority and lower income households. This was in 2004 that they wrote this report. So home ownership is definitely a large part of creating wealth. And just to show you how unfair it was, I was able to get a hold of the underwriting manual that was written and distributed by the Federal Housing Administration in 1938. And I am going to let it scroll through a part of it so that you can see how pervasive the issue of racism was in this manual. So you may be wondering, how many cities actually used redlining? Well, I took some screenshots of cities' redlining maps from Google Images, and I stopped when they started being repetitive. Five screenshots of a small as I can make it display of pictures of cities' redline zones. How many black families today have less wealth than I do because their fathers or grandfathers or any heads of household could not access funds from the New Deal, from the GI Bill, from the FHA, for neither home ownership nor education. My father advanced in his job because the GI Bill paid for a correspondence course in welding. My parents bought their first house with a guaranteed loan from the VA thanks to the GI Bill. My first husband and I bought a house with his GI Bill benefits, and he took college courses paid for with that benefit. Later, I bought a home on my own with an FHA loan. This is one of the effects of systemic racism. Bureaucrats make economic decisions from a purely financial standpoint, and that has far-reaching consequences for real people and for our society. So you may be wondering, like some people were in the class where I taught this live, why did blacks who served in the military not benefit from the GI Bill? Well, this was not an unconscious act. This was planned and executed to be that way. Representative John Rankin from Mississippi was the chairman of the World War Veterans Committee. And he made sure that Southern states could maintain white supremacy. And this is just a list of things that he made sure were part of the bill. He was involved in writing it. He was involved in lobbying for its passage and all of that sort of thing. And he made sure that southern states could keep their system. Some important elements of it. Because he was chairman of the World War Veterans Committee, he was a powerful figure in writing the bill and getting it passed. And he worked very hard to ensure there was no federal oversight of the administration of the benefits of the bill. He did not want any federal oversight because the states would have no leeway in how they administered it if there was federal oversight. So different states created their own policies to suit their own interests. This was not just a Southern problem, as we'll see in a minute. This picture is of a typical college classroom after the war. There are no black men in the picture. Now, here are some charts that shows data from the era. 1946 college enrollment. The orange line represents percentage of black enrollment of all colleges. The blue line represents how many were whites. 1946 black farm veterans in college. Now, it was extremely important for farmers to go to college in order to be able to keep their farms, to learn how to manage the money and all of the issues in the modern world. And black farmers were excluded from that opportunity. Job training participants, such as what my father went through. And here's a percentage of acceptance into job training programs by race. So the problem was exacerbated by the system of higher education, which had its own abusive policies. There we go. It was a system, and it was racist. So let's move on to the home ownership part. They were excluded from benefits because states ran it. And people in the states said, we want white tenants in our white community. Here is the percentage of VA guaranteed mortgages in two different areas. One is in West Virginia and one is in New Jersey. The percentage in both cities of black ownership is 0.15%. And then this is the percentage of home ownership these days. The blue line is white, and the third line from the bottom that's kind of red, that is the black ownership. So now we're going to move on to the justice system. And how did that all come about? Well, you notice that the number C here, in the 1830s, I wasn't able to find the exact year, but in the 1830s, Boston formed the first fully funded full-time police force. And that was the first time that whites were systematically policed in this country. Now, blacks had been affected by the justice system from the time they were ejected from the hellholes that brought them to this country. But the whites were not until the 1830s. We're going to look in more detail at numbers F, G, and H. If you're like me, you have no idea how they were or are disproportionately targeting the black community. In fact, I'd never heard of the prison industrial complex or the school to prison pipeline before I got into studying these issues. For those of you who are African American, you may not have heard those terms, but you are definitely aware of their effects on your families and friends, as we'll see as we go through. All right, in 1971, the war on drugs started. And here we go. There are way more people incarcerated for drugs than for any other offense. Blacks are imprisoned for drug offenses at 10 times the rate of white people. And you know what? People in prison cannot create wealth for their families. They just can't. The prison industrial complex. It's a term we use to describe the overlapping interests of government and industry that use surveillance, policing, and imprisonment as solutions to economic, social, and political problems. Here's the result of that. The U.S. population is 60% white, 18% Latino, 13% black. Well, incarcerated population, 38% of them are white, 38% of them are black, and you see how it disproportionately affects the population. The American Civil Liberties Union says that 1 out of every 3 black boys born today can expect to go to prison in his lifetime, as can 1 of every 6 Latino boys, compared to 1 of every 17 white boys. Now, 1 in every 17 is way too many, but 1 out of 3 is heartbreaking. The school to prison pipeline. This is a graphic that you don't have to be able to read all of it to see the disparities. The 31% is the number of represented by black students. Black students represent 31% of school-related arrests. School-related arrests. Not something they've done outside of school, but some kind of action they've taken in school. Black students are suspended and expelled 3 times more than white students. And students suspended or expelled for a discretionary violation are nearly 3 times more likely to be in contact with the juvenile justice system the following year. So, school is a dangerous place for our black children. Out of school suspensions. The pink is the number, the enrollment, and the blue is out of school suspensions. So you see that the blue line outweighs the pink line for blacks, and for whites there's more enrolled than there are suspended. Now, from slavery through the black codes, the civil rights protests, the war on drugs and all that followed, our legal system not only recognized the inequalities but sustained them. The police were sworn to uphold the order that the law had established. That was the policeman's job. Well, what was the result of that? The pattern of police interaction with African Americans was created and has not been diligently challenged. As an example, from slavery times, we still have people, and disproportionately law enforcement people, who believe the myth of the black man's inherent tendency toward unprovoked violence. And when I did this live in the classroom, I asked people, how many of you are afraid of a big black man if you happen to encounter them on the street or something like that? And I didn't count the number of hands that went up, but there were quite a few people who were honest and said, yeah, I'm afraid of a big black man. Why? Because we've inherited this attitude that they are inherently violent. Now, another part about the police department, if you're going to be a policeman or policewoman, you have to fit into the culture. There's group solidarity, there's loyalty. Those are fine. They're good things to have out of a group. Policemen have a tendency to respond with force to any challenge of their authority. In order to be accepted within the group and promoted, if anti-black racism is present, then you too must adopt it, or you will not get promoted. And a prevailing attitude, this is one my daughter reminded me of. The prevailing attitude is that if you're arrested, you must be guilty. And the part about the way that law enforcement in general treats our black citizens is not just physical. There are demeaning words and gestures. There are sexual assaults against black women. There's intimidation. And of course, police homicides. And there's corruption within African American neighborhoods that the whole neighborhood knows what kind of corruption certain police officers are involved in their neighborhoods. And then there is complicity and sometimes actual joining with vigilante groups such as KKK. Back in the day when it was prevalent, there was a lot of law enforcement that was part of KKK. When white fear prevails, the mostly white police forces respond accordingly. And you know what? At every stage of all these gears turning in our history, more black dead bodies come out of the systems. Is it any wonder that black people mistrust law enforcement more than white people do? This leads us to the last topic, Black Lives Matter. It was formed in 2013 after Trayvon Martin's murder. Their mission is to eradicate white supremacy and build local power to intervene in violence inflicted on black communities by the state and vigilantes. Now, I deliberately used the pronoun we here because I am not a card-carrying Black Lives Matter person, but I do believe that black lives matter. And so I say what we are saying, what we are not saying, and why we are saying it. What we are saying is black lives matter. We are working to make them matter to police, to the courts, legislators, and society. We are not saying that white lives don't matter. We are not saying that blue lives don't matter. We are not saying eliminate policing. And why are we saying that Black Lives Matter? Well, here's just a short list of why. Whoops. That was supposed to scroll. So just to pick 3 of these. 3 Black people who were killed for offenses that were not life and death offenses, if they even committed them. But if they did, they were not threatening someone else's life. So for every 1 white person that is killed by police, there are 3 Black people killed by police. This white young man was killed by Fresno police who assumed he was reaching for a weapon. He had not had the talk. Now, the talk is what every Black parent has to have with their children, especially their sons, to say, this is how you must act if you ever encounter a law enforcement person for any reason. This is how you must act to be sure you stay alive. I did not have to have that talk with my son. It never even occurred to me to have a talk like that with my son, because I assumed that he would not be killed for something that was not a capital crime. Black parents don't have the luxury of avoiding that topic. So the rate at which Black Americans are killed by police is more than twice as high as the rate for white Americans. So what does all this mean in real life? Well, we're talking about health, well-being, wealth. We're talking about quality of life here. So health. There are disparities in health and dying outcomes between white people and Black people. Here's a little chart that I found. So the dominant group imposes cultural trauma and withholds cultural resources and imposes stigma and withholds flexible resources. And the result is health disparities in the Black community. So the life expectancy of an African American is 74.6 years. For a white American, it's 78.9 years. But that does not count the toll that racial trauma takes on. You know, I used to wonder, why was it, I saw the statistics, why was it that Black people had a higher degree of blood pressure problems than white people did? Well, when I began studying this and learning about what they go through, I think, my goodness gracious, my blood pressure would be sky high if I had to put up with what they put up with every day. We're going to talk about that again here in just a second. Now, before you say, well, they both live into their 70s, how much would any of us give for an extra 4 years of not just life, but healthy life? The microaggressions, the insults, the looks, the gestures, all of these sorts of things. The cumulative effect is trauma. The psychology department of the University of Maryland did a survey of Blacks' experiences of microaggressions that they had experienced. Here is the result of that study. And these are the answers that the people gave. Again, we're not going to read them in detail, but just look at how many of them there are. These things happen every single day to our African American friends. Maybe not all of them to every person, but every day they're experiencing some of these. If they leave their community of where the whole community is black, if they happen to live in that kind of community and never get out of it, maybe they don't experience it. But where we are, they experience it every day. And then wealth. We've examined some of the ways wealth disparity has been created. So here's the data from Department of Labor, I think. A black woman, average numbers now, inherits $280,000. Let me just ask, Brenda, did you inherit $280,000 when your parents died?
I'm not, excuse me, I'm not sure I inherited $280, much less $280,000.
Yeah. Okay. Now, I'm a white woman, and I did not inherit $525,000 either. So, but I did inherit more than $525. So these numbers are not necessarily representative of us. They are averages, but they point out disparities. So, and then the yearly incomes are also averages. Now, these are the numbers that I pulled from government sources to use in playing the game. I'm thinking right now that it's probably not a good use of our time to try to play the game. It was a little bit awkward even in live. Playing the game showed what the differences of experiences are, and it's a valuable thing to do, but it's just really hard to do it over Zoom. So instead of doing that, I want to stop sharing. Well, let me just show you the rules of the game because they help show some of the things. White players are only restricted as the only restrictions they have are those that are imposed as a result of playing the game, but black players cannot buy within a certain area unless a white owner sells to them privately, or they draw an opportunity card, and they can't buy into the 1% area unless they have at least $1 million in net assets. So that's kind of the rules that are there to illustrate the differences that the black people encounter. Now, I will tell you that when we played this live one time, we had the white people playing as black people and the black people playing as white people. White woman who was playing as a black woman was falling farther and farther behind in her wealth. And she got sent to jail. And one of the people who was a black person playing as a white person bailed her out of jail. And the next turn, she got an opportunity card that said, for the next 3 turns, you get to play as a white person. Well, in those next 3 turns, she got more money when she passed start than she would have gotten if she played as a black person. And a couple of other things that happened. Anyway, she ended up with way more money than she had had before, and we finished the game, and she ended up, being better off than the black person who bailed her out. And I said, do you remember why you won the game? And she said, what? I mean, she'd totally forgotten. And I said, it's because you got to play 3 turns as a white person. If it hadn't have been for that, you'd have still been in jail or would have gone back to jail. And she said, I totally forgot about that. So that was one effect of playing the game. So I'm going to stop sharing now. Okay. So we're all here, and I want to see if you have any questions or comments.
I don't have any questions, but I have several comments, but I would like for Barbara and Carlista to go before me.
Okay, I'll go. This is Barbara. It was very enlightening. The numbers, usually numbers don't lie, and I really don't know what to say because it's really very overwhelming. All of these statistics, all of everything that has been presented here, it's very overwhelming. I'm the type person, I like to process information.
Yeah. I
And there's
understand
a lot
that,
of-
Barbara.
And there's lots of information here.
I'm a processor also, but this is reminding me. I was a teacher. I'm a retired teacher now, but I was a teacher all my life, and somewhere I just can't quite remember what year, but nor do I remember the book, but I remember the experience that as the whole school district, it was required to read a book, and then you met just with your staff every, I don't know if it was once a month or so, to talk about a chapter. And it was all about how we, white privilege, and how I realized at that time how unaware I was of how pervasive it really is in our history, and just even in the day-to-day interactions with people. I mean, every once in a while I would have a Black student in my class, but I lived in very much a white community, and I just had no idea, really had no idea. And that was kind of my first glimmer, and I will totally admit I kind of rejected some of it as like, no way. I mean, truly, those words in that book do not describe me. But the more over time, and reading more, and as I've become more educated and exposed, I realized I mean, yeah, I am a part of it just by situation, if nothing else. And I still consider myself quite ignorant, I guess would be the word, of just how deep some of this goes into just the systems that we have in our society. And it is overwhelming, very overwhelming. And you think, so what do I do?
Yeah.
What
Well,
choices
Brenda,
do I make?
Yeah, right.
I would
Brenda, before you speak, I would like to do one more thing that I forgot to do, but I'm not gonna put the presentation up again. I'm just gonna make one more comment. And I did this in the live session too. If you would be happy to receive the same treatment that our Black citizens generally do in this country, please raise your hand and keep it up until I count all the hands. In the live presentation, there were not any hands raised. And I said, oh, you didn't understand the question, and I asked it again. And I got this from someone else who had done that. But that really struck home with me when I heard that woman. I watched a video of it, and she asked that question, and I thought, I wouldn't. That says a lot right there.
Mm-hmm.
Barbara, were you going to say something?
Yes, back at the first of the presentation, when you showed the ratio in the Kingsport area of the white population, my area is really not like that. My children attended the Alcoa school system, and that ratio was there were like 1/3 Black students. And I like the Alcoa system because my children were exposed to diversity. So I'm a little different from your area.
Right. Yeah, I definitely, I grew up, of course, where you are, and so I was more used to the black presence, and so I was surprised when I moved here, and you really do have to be intentional
Mhm.
to run into any of them.
Well, I don't, and I have several friends that are Black, and just dear, precious people in my
Yeah,
life.
yeah, exactly. Okay, Brenda.
Well, first of all, I want to thank God because He has just brought me through so much. I'm 73 years old, so that Barbara and Callista will know the age and in context of what I've been through. I'm originally from Rome, Georgia, and I grew up in segregation. And I'm only 2 generations removed from slavery. My grandfather was born a slave, his parents were slaves. And so, all of this is really hits home to me in a very emotional way. I'm fighting back tears as I'm talking to you. And so I want Barbara and Callista to know that I'm overwhelmed too. So we all share that. Um, One of my most favorite scriptures in the Word of God is John 10:10. And it says that the thief cometh not before to steal and to kill and to destroy. Talking about the adversary, Satan, Lucifer, whatever you choose to call him. But Christ says, I am come that you might have life and have it more abundantly. And so I praise God for sending his son so that I could live a more than abundant life to the degree that I am able. I also want to thank my dear friend and sister Sharon. We've shared many tears together, so she will not find this unusual at all. I tell her all the time she's one of my best friends, but she makes me cry the most often. But that is through tears of sincerity. As you all might imagine, in my 73 years of life and having been the first and only African American, the first and only woman in so many things, I've gone through a lot. But she and I, over the past almost 7 years now, I think, Sharon,
Yeah.
have had very difficult conversations, both about racism, Black Lives Matter, but as well as women, as Christians, as mothers, as grandmothers, as sisters. And so she is one of the most important people to me in my life. And I love her dearly, and she knows that.
It's my privilege. It's my, it's part of my calling
Mhm.
as a Christian to shine a light on this, on injustice wherever I see it. And this is a place that I see it so many times. So, like I said, I'm not an expert by any means. I'm just willing to talk about it. I'm willing to listen, as you know, Brenda. I'm willing to empathize as much as I'm able. I'm willing to put myself out there, as you know, to challenge people who are many times unconsciously operating this way.
Mhm.
So thank you all for being here. The people who watch this recording are going to be blessed by your presence, the fact that you were willing to join in this, and by your comments. Uh, they're going to identify with the overwhelm. I know they are. And that's going to give them permission to take time to process it. You know, when I first started learning about this, I didn't want to take time to process it. I wanted to fix it. But first of all, no one person can fix it. And for me to even figure out how I could be part of the solution, I had to take time to process it. And I did a lot of that before I ever met Brenda. She was an answer to prayer because as I said, you have to be deliberate in this area to make friends with a person of color. And so I had been searching for one. And then she came to our church and made a presentation, and I asked, what can we do? And she said, make a friend of a person of color. So after that, I started praying, Lord, send me a person of color. And about 18 months went by of me praying for this, and every time I'd run into a black person, I would more or less say, will you be my friend? Not quite so directly, but almost. And then finally, see, Carlista may know, but Barbara, you don't. Brenda is a celebrity in this area. She has served on countless boards. She is known as a diversity trainer. Eastman has hired her, I don't know how many times, to give presentations there. People in this area know Brenda. And they know she's got a doctorate and so forth. And so the Lord kept telling me, get in touch with Brenda and ask her to be your friend. And I thought, you know, that's like asking some sort of movie star to be my friend or something. But finally, I did contact her and said, basically, you came to our church and said, make a friend of a person of color, so will you be my friend? And we had lunch at the Chop House. And at the end of that lunch, we held hands and said, we are sisters in the spirit. And it's been growing ever since then. So thank you all for being here and participating. And maybe someday if I see you in person, we might play that game in person.